En nombre de todo lo bueno, en nombre de todo lo santo. Amén. Por favor, tome asiento. Please be seated. A timely juxtaposition confronts us today. We have before us, first of all, texts that build on last week's call. If you remember the story of the rich man who comes to Jesus. Last week's call to reevaluate the way we both engage with wealth and the advantage that it brings. And also reevaluate our willingness to benefit, just as the rich man did, from the system that does harm to so many sisters and brothers. So we have that going on. And we also have the conclusion of National Hispanic Heritage Month, as was mentioned at the beginning of the service. Something we have, until this date, only hoped to acknowledge. But today we want to do more. And I want to start with the texts briefly, very briefly. First, from Isaiah. This is a familiar Good Friday passage, as the words of the prophet here in the second Suffering Servant song, as it's called, have been appropriated by elements of the Christian movement. But they have also helped to shape a particular understanding of Jesus which evolved with that movement. And I only want to note for Isaiah, just because I cannot resist, that he leaves the texts unintentionally vague. By that I mean the identity of the suffering servant. In the first place, it could be a leader, not a Messiah. Isaiah is not writing this envisioning Jesus. But it could be a leader, not the Messiah, as I said, but perhaps modeled on the kings of the most primitive cultures, who would step up and metaphorically, and also quite literally, accept the consequences for the actions of his people. I always think of the movie Joe versus the Volcano. You're the king, and then we're going to toss you in there, and then we'll get the next king, and you do that for us, and we'll all be happy. And perhaps Isaiah, this is second Isaiah, written during the exile, perhaps writes this to inspire a Hezekiah-like reformer. But the suffering servant could also be the nation itself, Israel, suffering collectively for the many sins of their ancestors, but at the same time opening the way for a brighter future that perhaps only in Isaiah has the courage and wisdom and vision to see. In Mark, we get another take on the cost of discipleship. Again, last week it was how we engage with wealth and advantage. And this, within this, we go even deeper into the whole idea of sacrificial suffering. And we know the story of James and John. We hear it every 3 years, so it should be familiar. And they come to Jesus with a request. He asks what it is. And they want to be seated at his right and left when he comes into his kingdom. It's a great story, and one with a serious twist. Because Jesus takes their requests and asks, are you certain you want this? Because it's going to involve a cup and a baptism of sorts. And James and John assure him that they want this and that they are ready. Jesus tells them that indeed they will do the cup and baptism thing. There'll be no escaping that. But as to who will be at the right and left when he comes in his glory, that is not up to him. Of course, at the end of the gospel, Mark will finally show us who does get to be at the right and left when Jesus is finally revealed in triumph. And they are the two bandits that hang at his right and left. Bandits, which means, I believe they were outlaws, Robin Hoods, if you will, unsung heroes, unknown, who had performed a bit of leveling of the economic playing field, if you know what I mean about Robin Hood, but who are now getting their just reward for trying to help the people. The point I want to make is, in this text, is that discipleship comes with a real cost. and glory comes in the act of self-sacrifice. Which I think is the perfect segue to move into that intersection we have with Hispanic heritage. And some of our more accessible saints who have run the good race, as Paul would say, and who in this month of celebrating Hispanic heritage are more than deserving of a few minutes of our time. And if we think about it, we probably know some of these people. The Americas have had their share of saints in the last few centuries. And people like San Juan Diego, or St. Rose of Lima, or St. Martin de Porres among the saints who will enjoy greater popular devotion and are names we may have heard. Yet inspired by this text about the two unknowns who occupy the spots on the right and left of Jesus, I'm taking this past 30 days, the Hispanic Heritage Month, as an invitation to do a deeper reflection on the lives of unknown saints, who, like the nameless bandits on the cross, have deeply impacted different Latin American countries, including our own, through their faith and work, and whose example has had the power to impact people around the world. And here are a few perhaps that you did not know, and I promise one that you do. Now, while Santa Rosa de Lima is the patron saint of Peru, first I want to share with you the name of another Peruvian. And this is Saint Toribio de Mogrovejo. He was born in Spain, and Toribio, we are told, was a pious young man and was an outstanding law student. And following that, became an outstanding and rather renowned law professor. Anyways, it turns out, if you're that famous, eventually it reaches the court of King Philip II, who eventually nominates him for the vacant Archdiocese of Lima, Peru, even though Toribio was a lawyer and not even a priest. We're not going there. But the Pope accepted the king's request despite the future saint's protests. And before the formal announcement, he was ordained a priest, and a few months later, he became a bishop. Once in Peru, we are told he walked back and forth across his diocese, evangelizing the native populations. It is said that he baptized nearly 500,000 people, including St. Rose of Lima and St. Martin de Porres. He learned the local dialects, produced a trilingual catechism, and fought for the rights of the indigenous population, and made evangelization a major theme of his episcopacy. He also worked devotedly for archdiocesan reform after realizing the church was involved in impurities and scandals. As a sidelight, just to make the story more interesting, it is said he predicted the date and hour of his death. And that's right, I'm going to die at this particular time and day. And he is buried in the Cathedral of Lima, Peru. Mariana de Jesus de Paredes, the patron saint of Ecuador. She was born in Quito, and not only became the country's first saint, but was also declared a national hero by the Republic of Ecuador. As a little girl, we are told that Mariana showed a profound love for God and practiced long hours of prayer and mortification, more to die, the death to sin, death to the sin in the body, and adopting the more spiritual disciplines. And that mortification to be accomplished through fasting or abstinence, things like that. She had tried joining a religious order on 2 occasions, but various circumstances, including her parents, would not permit it. But this led Mariana to realize that God was calling her to holiness in the world and not behind covenant walls. She did eventually build a room next to her sister's house where she could go devote herself to prayer and penance. It's also said that she lived miraculously only on the food of the Eucharist. She was known to possess great gifts of counsel and prophecy. As the story goes, in 1645, earthquakes and epidemics broke out in Quito, and she offered her own life and sufferings that they might end. And they did stop on the day she made that offering. And on the day of her death, it is said, a lily is said to have bloomed from the blood that was drawn and then poured into a flower pot, which has earned her the nickname, the Lily of Quito. Saint Teresa of Los Andes, or Teresa of Jesus of Los Andes, was Chile's first saint. And she was the first decalcid Carmelite to be canonized outside of Europe. She was born as Juana in 1900. The future saint was known to struggle with her temperament as a child, being proud, selfish, and stubborn. But she became deeply attracted to God at the age of 6 and showed extraordinary intelligence, which allowed her to understand the seriousness of receiving her first communion. She changed her life, becoming a completely different person by the age of 10, again practicing mortification and deep prayer. At age 14, she decided to become a decalcid Carmelite and received the name of Teresa of Jesus. Deeply in love with Christ, the young novitiate told her confessor that Jesus told her that she would soon die, something she accepted with joy and faith. It was shortly after this that she contracted typhus and died at the age of 19, 6 months short of finishing her novitiate. She was still able to profess her vows, and I quote from her biography, in the danger of death. Around 100,000 pilgrims visit her shrine in Los Andes annually. There is St. Laura Montoya. After her father died in war when she was only a child, she was forced to live with different family members in a state of poverty. This reality kept her from receiving a formal education during her childhood. And what no one expected is that one day she would become Colombia's first saint. Her aunt enrolled her in school at the age of 16 so she would become a teacher and be able to make a living for herself. She learned quickly and became a great writer, educator, and leader. She was a pious woman and wished to devote herself to the evangelization and education of the native population. As she prepared to write Pope Pius X for help, she received the Pope's new encyclical on the deplorable condition of indigenous peoples in America. Laura saw this as confirmation from God, and she is the one who founded the missionaries of the Immaculate Heart and St. Catherine of Siena, working for the evangelization of the indigenous, but also fighting on their behalf for basic rights, among those the right to be seen and loved as the children of God. St. Manuel Morales was a layman and one of the many martyrs of Mexico's Cristero War in the 1920s. It was between 1926 and 1928, an interesting chapter in Mexican history. Google it sometime and read about this conflict. He joined the seminary as a teen, but had to abandon this dream because of his family's finances. He became a baker, he said quite a good one. He was married and had 3 children. This change in his plans, however, did not prevent him from bearing witness to his faith publicly. He became the president of the National League for the Defense of Religious Liberty, which was being threatened by the administration of President Plutarco Elias Calles. Morales and 2 other leaders from the organization were taken prisoner as they discussed how they might free a friend priest from imprisonment through legal means. After their arrest, they were beaten, tortured, and then killed for not renouncing their faith. Before the firing squad, the very priest they were trying to free begged the soldiers to forgive Morales because he had a family. Morales responded, "I am dying here for God, and God will take care of my children." And his last words were, "Long live Christ the King." Oscar Anulfo Romero y Galdames is a prelate of the Catholic Church in El Salvador. He served as auxiliary bishop of the Archdiocese of San Salvador as Bishop of Santiago de Maria, and finally as the 4th Archbishop of San Salvador. As Archbishop, Romero spoke out against social injustice and violence amid the escalating conflict between the military government and the left-wing insurgents that led to the Salvadoran Civil War. And in 1980, he was shot by an assassin while celebrating Mass in a side chapel. In 1997, Pope John Paul II bestowed upon Romero the title of Servant of God, and the cause for his beatification was opened by the Church. This cause stalled, but was reopened by Pope Benedict XVI in 2012. On the 3rd of February 2015, he was declared a martyr by Pope Francis, which paved the way for his beatification on the 23rd of May. And during that ceremony, Pope Francis declared that his ministry was distinguished by his particular attention to the most poor and marginalized. And Pope Francis canonized Romero as saint on October 14th, 2018. Now, it's interesting about his career because Romero was seen as a social conservative at the time of his appointment as Archbishop in 1977, which worried many of his priests who feared their more progressive work among the poor would now suffer. Romero, however, was deeply affected by the murder of one of his priests, a friend and fellow named Rutilio Grande. Grande, a Jesuit priest, had been creating self-reliance groups among the poor. He had been organizing them. And as I said, his death had a profound impact on Romero, who later stated, "When I looked at Rutilio lying there dead, I thought, if they have killed him for doing what he did, then I too must walk the same path." Which to me yielded in time his most famous quote, which is, "When I give bread to the poor, they call me a saint. When I ask why the poor have no bread, they call me a communist." Romero urged the government to investigate Grande's murder, but they ignored his request. Furthermore, the censored press remained silent. But in response to his murder, Romero revealed an activism that had not been evident earlier. And he was now speaking out against poverty, against social injustice, against assassinations and torture, and became an outspoken critic of the military government of El Salvador. In the year 2010, the United Nations General Assembly proclaimed March 24th as the International Day for the right to the truth concerning gross human rights violations and for the dignity of victims, and they did this in recognition of the role that Romero played in defense of human rights. Romero actively denounced those violations of the most vulnerable people and defended the principles of protecting lives, promoting human dignity, and opposing all forms of violence. Latin American church groups often proclaim Romero an unofficial patron saint of the Americas and of El Salvador. Outside of Catholicism, he is honored by other Christian denominations, including the Church of England and the Anglican Communion and the Episcopal Church, where we celebrate his day on the day that the UN has demarcated, March 24. He is also one of only 10 20th century martyrs who were given statues above the great west door of Westminster Abbey in London. I could go on all day. I had another dozen or so to choose from. But I'm glad to have had the opportunity to share with you the lives of a few of those saints who, like James and John, were willing to accept that cup and accept that baptism, and who are not only part of the Hispanic heritage that we celebrate this month, but who also serve us as models of faithful obedience to the loving mandates of the gospel, whatever the cost. And I think it's fitting to close with a prayer that we offer each Wednesday when we remember those holy women and holy men who have run the race and who continue to inspire us who wish to follow where they have led. And it is during our Wednesday Eucharist when we say these words, It is right and a good and joyful thing, always and everywhere, to give thanks to you, Father Almighty, creator of heaven and earth, for the wonderful grace and virtue declared in all your saints, who have been the chosen vessels of your grace and the lights of the world in their generation.